At the commencement of my program yesterday, I discussed reports about an attack by Azerbaijan upon the Armenian-controlled region of Nagorno Karabakh, claimed by Azerbaijan, and I said that I would return to this topic in today's video. And indeed, there's been a lot of dramatic events in and around Nagorno Karabakh over the last few hours. Briefly, this was a major attack by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has re-equipped its military extensively over the last 10 years or so, acquiring arms from various sources, including Turkey and most recently Israel. The Armenian forces defending Nagorno-Karabakh are massively outmatched, and the early reports spoke of the Azerbaijani forces quickly overrunning Armenian positions in Nagorno-Karabakh. Shortly after, a statement was issued by the Armenian government, that is the government of the state of Armenia, which said that they would not involve themselves, Armenia would not participate in the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, thereby in effect leaving Nagorno-Karabakh to itself. There was a flurry of diplomatic activity that took place. There were calls by Armenian leaders, including the Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, to various friends of Armenia, including, and most specifically, I noticed a call to Secretary of State Blinken of the United States. There were various calls from around the world, including from Russia and the European Union and the United States, and by the way also Iran, for a ceasefire and negotiations and an end to hostilities. But the Azerbaijani government made it absolutely clear that as far as they are concerned, the only outcome that is acceptable is one in which the Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh lay down their arms. Any remaining Armenian troops in Nagorno-Karabakh are withdrawn, that the heavy weapons, such as there are still in Armenian possession in Nagorno-Karabakh, be surrendered or transferred to Armenia. And of course, the Azerbaijani government is also talking about the dissolution of what it calls the illegal government, legal entity that exists in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, over the last few hours, there's been reports that the Russians have managed to broker what the Russians call a ceasefire. And there's been an announcement to that effect by the Russian Defense Ministry. It reads as follows: an agreement on the total cessation of hostilities was achieved between the Azerbaijani side and representatives of Nagorno-Karabakh through the mediation of the command of the Russian peacekeeping force. The implementation of these agreements will be carried out in coordination with the command of the Russian peacekeeping force. From what I can understand, this doesn't provide details of the ceasefire agreement, but from what I can understand, it is to all intents and purposes a capitulation by the authorities in Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan's demands. Apparently, all heavy weapons are indeed to be transferred to Armenia, and the remaining Armenian troops are to be transferred to Armenia as well. Thereafter, I have to say, and it is difficult for me to say this as somebody who is of Greek nationality and who has strong feelings in this matter, strong feelings which I will not disguise are sympathetic to the Armenian people. Anyway, it seems to me that it is now all but inevitable that Azerbaijan will re-establish its control of Nagorno-Karabakh, and that this conflict in the Caucasus, in the southern Caucasus, which began in 1988 will in effect end with Azerbaijan in full control. Now, I have to say that this outcome, with hindsight, looks inevitable, going back to the coming to power in Armenia of the current Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan. Now, Pashinyan came to power as a result of a protest movement against the existing Armenian government, the previous Armenian government, which had very strong relations with Moscow. There were allegations of corruption, and Pashinyan engaged in public protests against the government on the basis that it was indeed corrupt, and for all I know, he may very well have been right. In fact, I have good reason to think that he was. Whether corruption has reduced since Pashinyan became Prime Minister of Armenia is something that I have absolutely no information or knowledge about whatsoever. Anyway, Pashinyan became Prime Minister of Armenia, overthrowing a government that was friendly with Moscow, and it is clear that from the outset, the Kremlin, the Russians, were both displeased about the change of government in Armenia and were mistrustful of Pashinyan. And in fact, there's recently been, just over the last few hours, there's been a statement from Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia and Prime Minister of Russia, and now the deputy head of Russia's Security Council and the deputy head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. We will discuss that entity shortly, later in this program. But anyway, Medvedev made it pretty obvious that from his first meetings with Pashinyan, he was deeply skeptical about Pashinyan's intentions, and that Pashinyan's subsequent actions reinforced his doubts about Pashinyan. And I think this was absolutely critical to the development of what happened thereafter, because up to that point, the Russians, though always careful to say that they were not directly involved in the conflict and always acting as mediators between Armenia and Azerbaijan, nonetheless, up to that point, they were in effect backing Armenia. Thereafter, from that moment, it became clear that with the Russians increasingly skeptical of Pashinyan and of his intentions, and believing that he was oriented towards the West, and that his objective eventually was to integrate Armenia in the Euro-Atlantic institutions, the European Union, and possibly, ultimately, even NATO. Anyway, from that moment on, the Russians became increasingly skeptical of him, and they began to reduce support for Armenia, and improve their relations with Azerbaijan. Now, it's important to say that this fell short of outright support for Azerbaijan, and Armenia and Russia continued to remain allies. Armenia continued to remain a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but it's clear that there was a chill in the relationship that hadn't existed previously. And the suspicion appears to have developed in Moscow that Pashinyan's real objective all along has been to find some way to offload Nagorno Karabakh, which is the issue that was preventing Armenia from joining the EU and NATO, that he was looking for some way to offload the problem of Nagorno Karabakh so that he could take Armenia into those Euro-Atlantic institutions. In other words, realign Armenia with the West. Now, the Russians might have been right or wrong about all of this, but it is fair to say that Pashinyan himself did little in the end to make them still their doubts. He was openly courted the President of France. He maintained strong relations with the US. Of course, Armenians will say, well, why wouldn't he? But the effect, the consequence of that was that, as I said, the Russians began to become increasingly doubtful about him. And what we saw over the last few years, there was the previous war that took place in 2020 rather, I should say, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which Armenia lost, and the Russians felt that he mismanaged the war and didn't make the most of his opportunities. And now there's been this announcement by Pashinyan's government that they will not defend Nagorno Karabakh, in effect ceding control of this territory entirely to Azerbaijan. And that decision came after a further decision that the Pashinyan government made some time ago in discussions with the European Union, which was to recognize Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Nagorno Karabakh. Now, this was done apparently without the Russians being consulted. Putin has complained about this fact, and Putin says that given that Armenia effectively recognized Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Nagorno Karabakh, there was little realistically further that the Russians could do about the status of this issue, or could do in terms of mediating the conflict, because Pashinyan essentially conceded the principle that this territory was part of Armenia and should be therefore logically fall under Azerbaijan's control. Anyway, there have been protests in Yerevan. There are protests outside the Parliament building and against Pashinyan, but it's clear to me that he continues to retain a critical mass of support in Armenia, and I expect him to survive these protests. Armenian officials are already questioning the purpose of Armenia's alliance with Russia, even though there are thousands of Russian troops in Armenia, and arguably they are the single factor that is protecting Armenia from a potential attack from Azerbaijan. And I understand that Azerbaijan does have territorial claims against other parts of Armenia as well, though whether it will seek to exercise them is a completely different matter. There have also been protests outside the Russian embassy, and I find that unsurprising. Many Armenians who have come to assume that Russia would be their protector and defender in this situation are understandably bitter and angry about the fact that the Russians have failed to come to Nagorno-Karabakh's rescue. But the Russians, for their part, not perhaps unreasonably, respond by saying that if Armenia is not prepared to fight and defend Nagorno-Karabakh and recognizes Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh, how can Russia reasonably be expected to protect Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia's place? It is a logical position, and it makes sense to me. But anyway, there it is. It seems to me likely that over the next few weeks, Pashinyan himself will blame the Russians for the debacle in Nagorno-Karabakh. I suspect that many people in Armenia and in the Armenian diaspora will agree with him. And I, for one, would not be surprised if this alliance between Russia and Armenia essentially ends, Armenia leaving the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Union, though whether that will benefit Armenia or not is another matter. My own view, which is the same view that Alex Christoforou has on the Duran, my colleague and friend, and which we've discussed already on the Duran, is that what this will do is will leave Armenia isolated in its region, surrounded by unfriendly neighbours, Turkey and Azerbaijan, and without the previous support that it had from its historic friends, Iran, and above all, Russia. But that is, I'm afraid, I think, the most likely outcome of all of this. Now, again, to respond to a point that is inevitably going to be made, of course, Armenia has a right to determine its own destiny, and it has a right to decide its own friends. If it chooses to leave the Collective Security Treaty Organization, then of course it can, and I don't think the Russians will take any action to prevent it doing so. What I will say, however, is that sometimes making choices has consequences that might not perhaps have been entirely what the person who makes the choices might have wanted. Perhaps it was right that the previous government in Armenia was corrupt or had problems with corruption. But apparently it was well organized from a military point of view. It knew how to conduct military affairs fairly effectively, and it did forge this close relationship with Russia, which secured Armenia's position in the Caucasus. Removing that government might have improved the corruption situation in Armenia, but it has also ultimately led, also it seems to me, to the loss of Nagorno Karabakh. Perhaps Armenians do want to work their way towards establishing relationships with new friends, but those friends are far away and they might not be able to help Armenia at a point of crisis, and it might not be so wise, in light of that, for Armenia to have alienated its historic friends. I hope, as somebody who has deep affection for the Armenian people, that that is not the situation that comes about. I wish the country well and the people well, but anyway, I hope that they don't regret the choices that they're making now. That is all I'm going to say about this topic on this programme. I will probably return to it, in fact, I'm sure I will return to it in discussions with Alex Christoforou on the Duran. And for more in-depth discussion of this conflict, I would ask you all to go and follow our discussions there on the Duran. I'm now going to return to the main topic of these programs for many months now, in fact for a year and a half now, which is the much bigger and, in terms of global consequences, the much more serious conflict, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, yesterday in my program, I said that there were reports that there'd been an attack or an attempted attack by Storm Shadow missiles on the Crimean Bridge. Well, I have to say that particular report seems to have faded. I'm not sure whether it took place. I rather doubt it, actually. But anyway, that's one story that came and went. Now, before I go into the detail of the important things, the discussions that are taking place in New York at the General Assembly, and the important meetings that Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, is now conducting in Moscow. And by the way, I should say that Wang Yi is not just China's foreign minister, but he appears to retain his position as President Xi Jinping's national security advisor. So he is in an extremely strong position in terms of overall management of China's foreign policy. But anyway, more about all of that in a moment. Let me touch briefly on the situation on the front lines. And the situation has taken an intriguing turn because it looks as if the Ukrainian offensive, not only has the Ukrainian offensive run out of steam, but it might be the case that the Russians are now gradually starting to gain the initiative. There were reports yesterday that the Russians have renewed their advances towards Kupiansk in the north, and that they're now intent on storming Petropavlovka, which is this village immediately to the east of Kupiansk, with a view to eventually capturing Kupiansk itself. There's only one report that said that. I don't have the full details. We'll have to see whether or not that is true. And I noticed that there's been very little said about this from other Russian sources. But we have had reports that in certain other places, the Russians are now gradually gaining the initiative. If we go to Bakhmut, the area around Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians claim to have captured Klashayevka and Andreevka, and as I've said previously, the reality is that these two villages are largely in the grey zone. Well, there are now reports of counterattacks by the Russians around these villages, and it seems to me that this is all very much part of the to and fro of the battles that take place around these villages. But further south and west, the Russians are now saying that they're gaining the initiative in the Vremevka salient area, that it is they, in fact, now who are advancing. And yesterday, there was a comment by our old friend Vladimir Rogov, and he said there is some success in the Vremevka area. There were offensive operations by Russian forces and counterattacks yesterday, and they were successful. Our boys moved forward through wooded areas over rough terrain by up to 1 kilometer and took control of some of the territory that was held by Ukrainian fighters. Ukrainian forces started to build rapidly a line of defense in the Vremevka area. According to intelligence data, visual monitoring, reports from local residents, work is underway to erect fortifications defense lines. They are not so much attacking as preparing for defense. And he also said that there were attacks by the Ukrainians near Staromayorskoye. Now, there's two villages with very similar names. I'm not absolutely sure whether these were... I think this is not Staromayorsk. I think this is a different village. But anyway, he then goes on to say that the enemy was dispersed by fire. There were attacks in the area of Novodonetskoye and Urozhainoye, and they were repelled as well. So there were some Ukrainian attacks, but overall, he says that the Russians have advanced in the Vremevka salient area by 1 kilometer. Now, that isn't a huge advance, but it is at least an advance of some kind. And then he's provided more information to TASS, and this is today. This is again Vladimir Rogov. There's been success in the Vremevka area. This is his comments today. Near Staromayorskoye, Ukrainian troops have retreated from the outskirts of the village where they have been trying to gain a foothold for a long time. I would even say that the initiative is in our hands in the Vremevka area. And of course, we had that comment from Rogov yesterday that the Ukrainians are actually now trying to create defenses in this area. They seem to be moving from the defense to the attack. Oh, sorry, from the attack to the defense. They're switching from offensive tactics in the Vremevka salient to a position of defense, trying to hold on to those positions which they captured over the course of their offensive, and for which, of course, they've had to pay a very heavy price. And a Russian military spokesman, Georgy Minenashvili, has reported that on the situation further north, in the Donbass, he says that the Russia's battle group south, the battle group's forces, backed by aircraft and artillery units, foiled 2 attempts by the Ukrainian armed forces to rotate their assault units near Klashevka and Vesyoloye. I'm not sure where Vesyoloye is. In addition, significant losses were inflicted on the enemy in the Andreevka area. The Ukrainian forces lost up to 215 troops. And he then goes on to say that Russian aircraft had hit enemy troop positions and equipment, destroying 2 temporary bases, 4 ammunition depots, 10 vehicles, an electronic warfare station, and a P-18 radar station. And the enemy lost 5 M777 mortar howitzers, 5 howitzers, 5 American howitzers, a US-made AN-TPQ-48 counter-mortar radar system, 2 self-propelled Gvozdika howitzers, a Gyatsynt B system, and 2 120mm mortars in the Solidar, Artyomovsk, Alexandro Kalinovo, Avdeevka and Lysychansk areas. So this is in central Donbass. But anyway, the impression the Russians are giving is that in the Vremevka salient, the initiative has passed to them, and in the Bakhmut area, the Ukrainians have exhausted their ability to continue their advances. Now, there's been much less news over the last few hours about what's going on in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area. I do gather that there have been more Ukrainian attacks there, but nothing of significance has been achieved. Certainly there's been no breakthrough. Yesterday I discussed how there's been discussions in the Western media, and especially the British media, about new limited objective being the town of Tokmak, that the forces that are the Ukrainian forces in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, that their objective now is not to battle through to the Sea of Azov, but to advance all the way to Tokmak, which is just 15 kilometers behind the Surovikin line, the first layer of the Surovikin line, which the Ukrainians haven't breached. Well, judging from the situation at the moment, they are not yet anywhere close to breaching the Surovikin line. They appear to continue to be stuck in these aimless but extremely costly battles in the area between Rabotino and Verbovoye, this salient that they've created for themselves in Russia's control zone, where, of course, they continue to suffer heavy losses with the Russians firing upon them from the surrounding heights. I would say that there's been some reports that the weather conditions are starting to turn and that the area has become wetter and damper and that the soil is becoming softer. That will be rather early for the Rasputitsa season to begin. But if that is so, then it seems to me that these Ukrainian troops who are in this salient between Verbovoye and Rabotino and he'd been trying to push south and west and to all of these various places without making much progress, it must be said, in these fields and woods between these various villages in the zone of control. Well, it does seem to me, to my untutored, non-military eyes, that they are in a rather precarious potential position. I don't know how strong Ukrainian reserves are in this area. The Russians seem to be suggesting that Ukrainian reserves are now largely exhausted, that only the 71st Jaeger Brigade is really left, and that there's been heavy losses on the part of all the other brigades that participated in the offensive in this area. Well, in the absence of strong reserves, there is a real risk, so it seems to me, that if the Russians do decide to counterattack in this area, then the Ukrainians have created a potential trap for themselves if they push their troops, if they keep their troops, try and keep their troops over the autumn and winter in this salient that they've carved out between Rabotino and Verbovoye. That's, of course, assuming that they can't capture these two villages, finally capture these two villages. Of course, some Western reporters claim that they have already done so, but I've explained many times that that is not the case. Anyway, if they can't capture these two villages, if they can't capture the heights, then they risk being trapped on the low ground, and that could be something of a debacle. Anyway, that's the news from the battlefronts. Rumours of Russian advances in the north around Kupiansk. These are, I should say, a little bit firmer than some other rumours that I've seen. This does look like a more serious Russian advance than the ones we've seen over the last few days. A situation around Bakhmut where the Ukrainians appear to have exhausted themselves. The Russians perhaps taking back the initiative in the Vremevka salient area. The offensive there appears to have been abandoned, if Vladimir Rogov is right, with the Ukrainians going over to the defense in this area, and the Ukrainians potentially, or so it seems to me, in a precarious position between Rabotino and Verbovoye. Anyway, that's the situation on the battle lines. There's been lots more Russian drone attacks across Ukraine. The Russians don't seem to be using missiles to the same extent that they have been. The West assumes that they're busy stockpiling these missiles in anticipation of the winter offensive that the Russians are widely assumed to be working towards. Of course, the West doesn't seem to be anticipating, isn't talking about a Russian ground offensive. They're talking instead purely about a Russian missile offensive against Ukraine's energy system. Whether, of course, that is correct is another matter. But we come back to that topic that I've discussed so many times, which is the shift now in Western perspectives about the war. There's been a most interesting article in Bloomberg, which essentially admits the failure of the offensive and now speaks about a long war. I've discussed this long war theory in various places up to this point, but this is now increasingly becoming the Western line. And I'm not going to read the whole article from Bloomberg. Bloomberg has a pretty tough paywall policy, which I'm not going to breach. But the title of the article reads, US and G7 allies now expect war in Ukraine to drag on for years. And the subtitles, there's two subtitles. One G7 official sees war lasting as long as 7 more years. That will be a 9-year war. And then the next subtitle reads, opposition to continued support is growing in the US and global south. A most ominous headline. A long war, 7 years. Now, I'm going to say straight away that people who talk about a 7-year war are almost certainly, at least this is my view, not taking heed of the realities. Now, I've already discussed in many places the scale of Ukrainian losses over the course of this offensive. There's been some commentary about this from a Ukrainian official, a commissioner who's in charge of mobilization or has had some responsibility for mobilization in the Poltava region of Ukraine. He's reported in the Ukrainian media or social media to have said that out of the previous draft, the previous round of mobilization that took place in his region, in Poltava region, 80 to 90% are either killed, wounded, or disabled. 80 to 90%. He also says that in Poltava itself, there is real difficulties with the call-up, because only 13% of people who are eligible to fight, and Ukraine is constantly now reducing its eligibility criteria for the kind of people who should be called up and who should fight. But he says only 13% are actually coming forward. Now, of course, that's Poltava. We don't know to what extent this is reflective of the general situation across the whole of Ukraine, but this is part of the accumulating information, all of which appears to support the view that Ukraine is suffering appalling losses, unsustainable losses, that its human resource base, if I can use that expression, its mobilization base is diminishing. And of course, the tragedy behind that, what that actually means, is that tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, wounded, disabled, and of course amongst the survivors, the psychological traumas must be exceptional. They're not to be underestimated, and they will continue to have their effect for decades to come. So already we see some of the problems with the long war scenario. There are fewer and fewer Ukrainians able and perhaps willing to fight, and there's been much Western commentary about the fact that those Ukrainians who are now being scooped up in the fresh mobilizations are not equal in morale and skill and motivation to the ones who have already been lost. The best have already gone. The trained NCOs, the trained junior officers built up by Ukraine over 8 years prior to the war, most of them have been lost. Those that are coming will not be of that kind of standard. So already we see that there are fundamental problems with the manpower base on a population pool that is, of course, significantly smaller than Russia's, and where, of course, large numbers of Ukrainians have fled abroad, though mostly, I suspect, women and children rather than men. Though there are some men who've gone to Europe have done so to avoid the draft. And by the way, most European countries that they've gone to have announced that they won't return them to Ukraine. I've already discussed in the past that it would be profoundly contrary to law to do so. And I'm relieved to see that on this occasion at least, most of the European countries where these people have gone have made clear that they are going to stick by their laws. But anyway, that's a problem of manpower. But there is also a problem of military strategic technical resources. And we've seen that Ukraine is due to receive 31 Abrams tanks. The United States has been careful, so it seems to me, to hold them back until after the offensive has basically run its course. These are older Abrams tanks. They don't have the special armor. They don't have the modern fire control systems. It's not obvious to me that they're a match to Russia's T-90M tanks, which are Russia's most modern tanks, operating on the battlefields in increasingly large numbers. I'm not even sure that they're up to the standard of the current Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 tanks that were supplied to Ukraine, because unlike the Abrams tanks, the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s do have, or are supposed to have, specialized armor. I would say that in the case of the Challenger 2, that doesn't seem to have done much difference. They were as easily destroyed by Russian anti-tank missiles as all other tanks that Ukraine has operated has been. So, maybe I'm missing something there, but it doesn't seem to me as if this is actually quite as consequential as some people think it is. But anyway, for what it's worth, these are small numbers of tanks from the West. Increasingly, Europe seems to be aiming to supply Ukraine with Leopard 1 tanks, leftovers from the Cold War, many of them in storage, many of them in bad condition. There's a rather disturbing, astonishing story that Ukraine has rejected 10 Leopard 1 tanks because during the training of the Ukrainian soldiers who were supposed to operate these tanks, the tanks got damaged. Apparently they're in somewhat a fragile condition and they got damaged. The Ukrainians themselves couldn't repair these tanks, so the Germans have to refurbish these tanks, these 10 tanks, to get them back into a workable condition. The Leopard 1 may have had its strengths back in the 1950s and 60s when it was first developed and put into service, but it seems to me that it is long beyond the point where it can function effectively on a modern battlefield. I suspect that with its thin armour and its relatively light 105mm gun, it will be comprehensively outmatched by the much more powerful and modern Russian tanks, the modernised T-72s and the T-90Ms. So, anyway, but it does seem to be the tank that the Europeans, for the moment, are intending to supply. And there's been no announcement so far of supplies by the United States of ATACMS missiles. This has been talked about endlessly. Could happen, it probably will happen. But as I've discussed already, the US is not keen to supply ATACMS missiles, whilst Zelensky is in New York, and we'll come to his visit to New York and what's going on there, and to Washington, D.C. and what's going on there in a moment. They're not keen to supply him with the ATACMS missiles. They're saying that what Ukraine really needs for the moment are more air defense missiles, except, of course, as it turns out, the United States is relatively short of those. But perhaps a more serious problem in sustaining a long war, even than the lack of equipment, of weapons that can be sent to Ukraine in order to keep it going through that long war, is that point that is made in Bloomberg. Opposition to continued support is growing in the US and global South. Well, we have had in New York a United Nations General Assembly session, and in the run-up to that session we were told that President Biden would address the General Assembly seeking to rally countries around the world to the cause of Ukraine. I have to say straight away that I tried to listen to President Biden's speech. I find it unengaging, and I was in any event, also, dismayed by his extremely halting delivery. This is becoming now increasingly obvious and an increasing problem. But anyway, the meeting lasted, the speech that President Biden delivered to the General Assembly lasted for 25 minutes. It was, in my opinion, full of cliches and said little of any significance. I don't think it was going to impress anybody in the hall. And as I said, the delivery was poor. But the key thing is that it had only 1 minute of comments devoted to the situation in Ukraine. And the White House has provided us with a text, and as it always does, by the way, with President Biden's speeches, and something which I find really extraordinary, it actually highlights, it doesn't try to obscure his stumbles, it actually highlights them. But anyway, I will read what he says, what President Biden said about the conflict in Ukraine. And this is what he said: sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights, these are the core tenets of the UN Charter, the pillars of peaceful relations among nations, without which we cannot achieve any of our goals. This has not changed, and that must not change. By the way, before I proceed, notice that he puts sovereignty, territorial integrity, and human rights at the same level. I've explained in the past how the United States actually uses human rights as its justification to qualify sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States says that because human rights somehow have at least equal significance to sovereignty and territorial integrity, that means that in practice human rights trump sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that allows the United States, in its support of human rights, and it's taken as axiomatic that it is the United States that is the guardian of human rights, that gives the United States the grounds upon which it can interfere in the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries. When President Biden uses those three words together: sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. For many countries around the world, that will ring alarm bells, and the Chinese have already publicly said as much, and on more than one occasion. But anyway, to continue with his speech, he then goes on to say this: yet for the second year in a row, this gathering dedicated to peaceful resolution of conflicts is darkened by the shadow of war. Notice again, he talks about the peaceful resolution of conflicts. An illegal war of conquest brought without provocation by Russia against its neighbour Ukraine. Well, of course, the Russians would say that there were many opportunities to resolve the conflict peacefully, the Minsk agreement being one, and they were not taken, and that was not their fault. And of course, they would deny that this is a war of conquest, and they would strongly deny the claim that it was a war brought without provocation. They would say that the provocation was extreme, the key provocation being NATO expansion, and they would be right. Anyway, he goes on to say this: like every nation in the world, the United States wants this war to end. No nation wants this war to end more than Ukraine. That, in my opinion, is the most important single sentence in these comments. The United States wants this war to end. No nation wants this war to end more than Ukraine. To my mind, that is another clear signal from the administration directed principally at the Ukrainians that they need to find some way to end the war in a way that does not compromise or affect the strategic positions of the United States. Strategic positions being, of course, the ability of the United States to expand NATO, continue expanding NATO, including into Ukraine, and of course its right to interfere wherever it chooses, including by giving Ukraine security guarantees, unilateral security guarantees, and weapons without the agreement of Russia. But anyway, he then goes on to say, and we strongly support Ukraine in its efforts to bring about a diplomatic resolution that delivers just and lasting peace. Well, Ukraine does have a peace plan, which is the Zelensky plan, but of course it is not a plan at all. It is a demand for Russia's unconditional surrender. And of course, Biden himself does not refer to Zelensky or to Zelensky's peace plan. He says that we strongly support Ukraine in its effort to bring about a diplomatic resolution that delivers just and lasting peace. So he's again telling the Ukrainians, hurry up and get yourself a negotiation with the Russians so that you can at least freeze the conflict, even if you don't achieve what we would define as a just and lasting peace. Then, of course, he goes on to say, but Russia alone bears responsibility for this war. Russia alone has the power to end this war immediately, and it is Russia alone that stands in the way of peace, because Russia's price for peace is Ukraine's capitulation, Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine's children. Last, of course, being a reference to the ICC case, which has been brought against President Putin and one other senior Russian official. And then Biden goes on to say, Russia believes that the world will grow weary and allow it to brutalize Ukraine without consequence. But I ask you this: if we abandon the core principles of and he actually said United States Charter, but the White House has corrected that to United Nations Charter, which is what, of course, he actually meant, to appease an aggressor. Can any member state in this body feel confident that they are protected if we allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation, and any nation secure? I'd respectively suggest the answer is no. We have to stand up to this naked aggression today and deter other would-be aggressors tomorrow. And I've discussed how increasingly now the talk is that we can't appease the Russians because doing so would send a bad signal to China. But anyway, that's what he said. And that's why the United States, together with our allies and partners around the world, will continue to stand with the brave people of Ukraine as they defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity and their freedom. Now notice that he does not use the expression "as long as it takes." That's not there in these words. So he says that they will continue to stand with the brave people of Ukraine. He says that they will defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity, but of course that's not contrary to a freezing of the conflict and de facto allowing Russia to continue to occupy the territories it occupies now. And he's telling Ukraine, we support you in negotiations and we support your desire for peace. You want peace more than anyone else, which is, of course, his way of telling Ukraine that we're tired of this war. We want to see this war end. We don't really want to be in a situation where we have to go on supporting you for 7 years. Our people in the United States are turning against us. The global south is unconvinced. We have to think about China. Our military resources are stretched. And of course, we now face mounting economic problems at home. So he's telling the Ukrainians, you must seek peace. It's no longer a case, it's not here in this speech any longer, as long as it takes. It's all about seeking peace. Now, whether Zelensky himself is able to read past these words, I'm not sure. But I suspect he is, because I suspect in private he is being told things a lot more forcefully than, of course, Biden can say them in a speech of this kind. But anyway, there we are. That's Biden's words. Now, Zelensky did, of course, deliver his own speech to the United Nations General Assembly. It said all the things that he usually said. It didn't break any new ground. He made it perfectly clear, however, that contrary to what Biden wants him to do, he is still deeply unhappy about being pushed into negotiations, even though it's absolutely clear to me that that is what the administration urgently wants him to do. Meanwhile, Zelensky is also preparing for his trip to Washington. He's not obviously going to address Congress. He's only going to speak with small groups of Congress people. He's going to come asking for more weapons. And this time, according to another article in the US media, he's been told to say thank you. So the administration is going to try to control his lobbying efforts in Congress. But already we see from that Bloomberg article the doubts about continuing the war are already increasing. And that the United States, the real policy of the United States is increasingly different They don't want to be in another forever war, even a proxy one. Well, that's the Americans. And we see that even though the Americans talk, the West talks a brave talk about a long war, they don't really want to see it happen. What about the other side? The Russians are not talking about negotiations, but they are talking other things. Firstly, an official of the Russian parliament, the Duma, has now made it clear that the 400,000 troops that Russia is gathering in the rear, the new contract soldiers, will not be replacing the reservists that were called up last year, the 300,000 reservists that were called up last year. So the Russian army is actually going to double in size by the end of this year. There will be 400,000 additional troops, together with the 300,000 reservists that were called up, and perhaps the 150,000 other troops that were already in theatre before the reservists were called up. This is a massive build-up of manpower, and it is a trained manpower. Professional soldiers, highly trained troops. The reservists have been serving now for a year, and of course the contract troops that were already there, they've been serving also. But Putin has been busy. And firstly, he had a meeting with members of his government in which he discussed the situation with the budget. He had positive things to say about the state of the Russian economy. He thinks that the Russian economy is doing well. But he also, as I said, had things to say. He also had a meeting of his military industrial commission. And he talked about a significant build-up in terms of military production. He said that in the first 8 months of this year, defence companies have maintained a stable operating rate and not only complied with supply schedules, but also managed to increase the output of some military products manifold. The output of major armoured vehicles has doubled compared to last year, whilst the production of most in-demand weapons has tripled. Now, he doesn't make it clear what the baseline is. We're assuming that last year, 2022, production had already increased, but we are getting the sense that things are moving forward, that there's been an acceleration of production. And he goes on to say, we need to boost production of counter-battery and air defence equipment, and I have issued a number of instructions to supplement the 2024 delivery schedule with corresponding items. And he says that there's going to be a review of the drafting process of the 2025 to 2034 state armaments program. We're looking at a long-term Russian build-up, not a short-term one, but suffice to say that the Russians, even as Ukraine's manpower base is becoming depleted, even as the West's ability to supply Ukraine with weapons, even as Ukraine's supporters in the West, their support is flagging, the Russians are becoming stronger. Their army is doubling in size, their weapons supplies are increasing, they're becoming increasingly confident, clearly, about the prospects for the war going forward in 2024. And I am going to repeat again the previous point. The point about all those heavy fortifications that were created by the Russians last year and this year was to to defeat Ukraine's ongoing offensive. In that, it has been comprehensively successful. The Russians used the time. They needed to do that because they needed the time to build up their armed forces in order to basically overwhelm Ukraine, which is what increasingly they look likely to do next year with this far bigger army that they're putting together. And the result is that the defeat of the offensive is for the Russians a major strategic victory. The fortifications, the skillful defense, bought the Russians the time and the space they needed for this colossal build-up, which continues to be underway. And in the meantime, the Russians continue to build up their critical alliances. We've had Kim Jong-un visiting Russia, and we had that very interesting and lengthy meeting in Russia, which I've discussed at length. He met with Putin, he visited all sorts of places. It's clear that relations with North Korea are strengthening. And there remain all those speculations and rumors that North Korea might supply shells to Russia. By the way, on that point, I've had a fascinating and very interesting email from a contributor. Again, I'm not going to reveal anything about this person. All I will say is he clearly knows, very knowledgeable about what he's writing. He's pointed out that there is the assumption that shells of the same caliber are interoperable and can be placed in different, that they can be used in substitution in the same guns, is far from being correct. Shells of the same caliber can be very different from each other and designed for entirely different guns. And that might affect Russia's ability to import shells from North Korea. That's one thing. The second point that he made to me, and just in passing, is that the claim that is, I've seen widely made, that the Challenger 2's rifle gun is longer ranged and more accurate than the smoothbore guns of the other Western tanks and of the Russian tanks is simply wrong. Anyway, I just wanted to say that, but that's in passing. The Russians built up their relationship with the North Koreans. Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, who of course was the first person to go to North Korea. Kim Jong-un came to Russia after Shoigu went to North Korea. Well, Shoigu is now in Iran, where he's having meetings with Iran's defense minister and is hailing military cooperation between Russia and Iran. And critically, we are now having a whole series of meetings between Wang Yi and the Russians. Wang Yi, having come from his meeting with Sullivan in Malta, a meeting which, as I said in my program yesterday, clearly didn't go well. Well, he's met with Lavrov. He's also met with the head of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and later today he is going to meet Putin himself. And apparently that meeting is going to happen in St. Petersburg. Putin's spokesman, Peskov, has confirmed it. And the Russians now have also provided a readout of Lavrov's meeting with Patrushev, and I noticed that amongst the things that it says the following, that the sides noted their similar positions regarding, this is the Russian readout of the meeting with Lavrov, regarding US actions on the international scene, including those with an anti-Russia and anti-China bias. Wang Yi informed Sergei Lavrov about the contents of his talks with the US President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. The ministers discussed a number of other issues of mutual interest. So Wang Yi has briefed the Russians about his meeting in Malta with Jake Sullivan. He's had a meeting with Khrushchev, and he's now going to meet Putin. And all of this preparing the ground for Putin's visit to China in October, when Putin will have a major summit meeting with Xi Jinping. Now, contrast all of this purposeful activity and these purposeful actions by Putin, who, by the way, has also, while he's about it, visited a factory where they make drones, which are being used in the special military operation. Anyway, contrast all of this purposeful activity with the bumbling speech the US president gave in New York, and all these whispers that we're getting about the need for negotiations and the worries about a long war. We see purpose on the one side, the Russian side, division and doubt on the Western side. And that is going to grow because, as I've said previously, the West is not going to get the long war. In the Bloomberg article, they talk about that as a grim prospect. But even that prospect is not going to be as bad as the one that is coming. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has suggested that instead the West needs to be prepared for a different possibility, that is of a Ukrainian collapse similar to the one that took place in Afghanistan. And, well, I'm not predicting that outcome, but it does seem to me that next year the situation in the conflict zone is going to be very different. Ukraine had its last real chance to achieve something it could call a victory in the offensive that is now essentially coming to its end. Next year, it will be Russia's turn, and the Russians are in a far stronger position to make whatever they want to happen. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, also, most of all. Also, remember, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the wonderful things that you will find there, our magic mugs and hats and hoodies and t-shirts and all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you have liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.